Welcome to The Golden Shadow, the podcast about psychology, philosophy, myth, mysticism, and mystery. My name is Arran Rogerson.
And I'm Alyssa Polizzi.
Today we explore the religious instinct. When we use the word religious, images of the 5 major organized religions will probably come to mind, like Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism. But this episode isn't really about that. This isn't about religion per se. This is about the way that humans tend to orient themselves towards the world, the systems that we desire to be a part of, the collections of rituals, practices, and philosophies from which we tend to derive the most meaning. And religion is actually present everywhere, in everyone, yet we hardly take notice because of the subtlety and complexity of these patterns of behavior. So we're talking about psychology. We're also talking about ways of being in the world. We're talking about meaning. We're talking about systems of social organization that people find themselves in. Alyssa, what do I mean by all this? What is the religious instinct?
The religious instinct, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is it's an archetypal framework. It's inherent to our consciousness, a basic need, an evolution of our psyche and spirit, whether we find it in the divinity of gods or in the sociocultural dynamics of modern day. The religious instinct is driving us towards discovery of meaning and understanding.
Right. So people tend to gravitate towards certain activities, groups, social organizations. There's narrative structures that we find very compelling in the movies, in books, in our video games. There's tribalism that we recognize. We use this word a lot now.
Sure.
Tribalism, we're often talking about politics.
Yeah.
But all of these things are pointing to this way of being human in which people get together around a common collective myth, you might say.
Yeah.
And that myth might be a true myth, but it's still a story.
Yeah.
People organize around stories, and they develop rituals, things that feel meaningful, things that are fun.
Yeah.
And it's hard to really separate what's fun and what's activating from what's meaningful.
Sure.
But a good example of a religious tendency, something that is an expression of this religious instinct, might be sports. And people wouldn't think of sports as being religious.
Right.
And I know that this is the reaction to us talking about this from some people might be like, well, that's absurd.
Right.
And like, excuse me, don't call me religious. And it's like, we're trying to avoid making accusations. We're trying to avoid reducing people's behaviors down to something that is religious, but there's sort of a pejorative association with the word religious, which is unfortunate, because there's no reason that should be a negative thing, because it really describes the way that humans are.
Yeah.
And with sports, for instance, you're organizing with a group of people around a common story, which is the story of your sports team or your sports league of the NFL, let's say. You have rituals where you get together every Sunday and you participate in this watching a game.
Yeah.
There's a annual big ritual of the Super Bowl. There's colors that you all adorn and you all wear together, and you find people who participate in these collections of practices, these rituals, and this common story. They find a deep meaning in this. They find a home. They find themselves plugged into something that feels right and grounded.
Yeah, and a marker, I think, also of that religious instinct being at play, that archetype being activated, is how much energy is around it. Emotional energy, this fanatical kind of dynamic connection that we have to something. And whether you're kind of in the stands, like rooting for your team, or you're at home yelling at the screen, like there is this sense of your spirit being captured in this. And it's not just this individual experience, it's collective. It's connecting you to this grander narrative of the team, perhaps, or to other people. You know, this person's on my side because we both root for the same team, or that person isn't, you know, and there's this really dynamic interaction that's happening around these situations that are activating, constellating that religious instinct.
Right. There's stories from the past even that we have sort of this legend of this one team from 1987 that played this one game the big game and where something crazy happened. They had a
Right.
crazy comeback. The quarterback at the time threw for an absurd amount of yardage,
Yeah.
or no one thought they could do it. And and these stories are actually collected into documentaries and things like that, and they're portrayed as a
Sure.
story that has a climax.
Yeah.
There's a build-up.
Right.
There's some sort of unforeseen obstacle that
Right.
emerges where someone gets injured on the team, and somehow they rally and they still win the Super Bowl. And this, even though this is a true thing that actually happened,
Yeah.
it's still a story.
Right.
It's still formatted in this sort of archetypal narrative of struggle, overcoming, taking risk, being heroic.
Right. It has the mythopoetic structure to it.
Exactly.
Which is like, red flag, like archetype is in play here. So this is something that's driving a powerful part of the human experience, meaning our psychological connection to it. It's something that's in some ways inexplicable, and yet we're so connected to it that we can't live without it. So even if you're not a sports fan, you might be finding this religious instinct coming alive in other parts of your life.
Right. So often, whatever we call religion, especially I would say nowadays, if you're living in a modern culture and you have a good education, and you have a scientific mind, let's say, and all kinds of reasons. But what we tend to do is we tend to reduce religion down to a set of beliefs. And usually those beliefs seem absurd. And so religion just becomes this idea of it's a collection of absurd beliefs.
Right.
And anyone who possesses those beliefs must be stupid or crazy.
Yeah.
And we tend to do this. And that's why religion can often get this sort of pejorative notion,
Sure,
which is
sure.
like, well, it's just what primitive people do.
Yeah.
And that's really ignoring the vast and deep, rich energy that is actually built into what religion is expressing or
Right.
achieving.
Because religious content, religious material should be thought of symbolically, metaphorically. Those stories, they are myths that have been raised up to this like epic proportion. And in the modern day, with a kind of an intellectual eye, we look at it and we just sort of scoff and we want to toss it aside. But this is a collective inheritance of our human experience, of the development of consciousness, of our orientation towards understanding mystery and the unknown, the numinous, that kind of divine quality that sort of is woven through just like the fabric of our experience. And we even see it today in wanting to understand like the true scientific creation myth, right? Now we use science as a vehicle for weaving that narrative of our understanding, but it in some ways still captures the same heart.
Right. And so, again, some people who might listen to this might feel offended by at first glance at like what we're saying, but I want to be careful here and try to suspend this response of like, well, that's ridiculous, that's absurd. Science is religious in a sense.
Yeah.
It's we have to be careful because the scientific method is not really religious. It kind of is working towards negating bias.
Sure,
The scientific
yeah.
method is a method of sort of figuring out like what's real and trying to counteract what we think or what we want to be real. But something like the Big Bang story, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's true.
Yeah.
It can be true, but it can still be a story. And the only way that we can really make sense of the Big Bang is to think of it in this narrative format.
Sure.
What is the Big Bang? It's the beginning.
Yeah.
We have to think of it that way because if we don't think of it that way, it's dry. It doesn't really seem to fit into the way that we structure our models of reality, our psychology, the way that we process information and create a map that helps us navigate the world. We're doing this constantly, and we need to think of the Big Bang as being some sort of story, a creation story.
Yes.
And so what happened at the beginning of the universe? A pin drop of rapidly expanding space-time appeared and expanded and expanded and expanded. And there was so much energy that from that was birthed the entire universe. Stars came into existence. They lit up the darkness, and suddenly there was light everywhere. And then planets came together, and then you had life on planets. And this is an epic story.
Yeah,
and we can't really make sense of it without having this sort of narrative format to it to really make sense of it, to tell it to children who are learning about the universe. And we see this pattern again of our psychology. We want to gravitate towards a grand narrative,
Yeah.
because if we don't have a grand narrative, there's no way for us to derive meaning in
Yeah.
our lives.
We can certainly think of this as the next step, the next evolution of the episode we did on personal myth,
Right,
which
right.
was more of the person-oriented version of what we're talking about. What is the myth of your life? What is the story that your consciousness is telling? What cohesive kind of storybook exposition is unfolding in front of you? But now we're kind of taking it to the next level, to the community level, to the human level, and that's the extension of the religious instinct, because it's simultaneously generating energy and meaning and insight for you on an individual level, and then connecting you out to everything else sort of in space and time.
Right, right. So if we can have a solid, big narrative, it allows us to make sense of the actions we take. It allows us to justify our suffering. Why am I working so hard? Why am I suffering so much?
Right.
Oh, there's a reason.
Right,
I'm part of a
right.
story, right? And so we need that. And,
Yeah.
and when that's absent from our lives, if there is no story to our lives, it's just, well, I'm suffering for no reason.
Right.
Everything's a joke.
Yeah.
Like, why do I even exist? What's the point of anything? And you can see that people arrive at that place. And so what the religious instinct is doing is it's gravitating towards constructing a myth, except it's collective.
Yeah.
Many, many people are doing it, and it's
Yeah.
evolving over time, and it becomes a better and better myth. It becomes a transcendent myth, by which I mean it sort of goes beyond just the story of our life now.
Yeah.
It's all lives. It's all of humanity. It's all of creation. And there's so much you can anchor into with your actions now, and so much you can anchor into with the story of your children and their children and their children.
Yeah.
And a lot of what we are looking for and craving is something that can accomplish this, some kind of myth. And so clearly, I would say religion, or organized religion, achieves this.
Yes.
That's in a big way, that's what's happening, is
Yes.
people are having a collective myth in which they can make sense of their lives, and it provides a moral framework
Yeah.
of what you should and should not do. And this has evolved to be actually good advice, probably,
Yeah.
of how you should probably live. And that gets complicated because the world changes very quickly nowadays, and we need to sort of adjust what you should and should not do. But it also provides practices, rituals, coming together for a communion
Sure.
on a weekly basis, or honoring the seasons or nature in some way, honoring the union between a man and a woman,
Sure.
honoring the birth, death.
Yeah.
There's
Life,
all these things that have evolved over time that are collective rituals and myths that help us maintain a structure by which we can live by.
Yeah, and a structure that allows us to relate to the tribal dynamic, to the family dynamic, to the community dynamic, to the world at large. It's an evolution that I think shows the necessary need for individuals to come together in some sort of group mindset that brings structure, safety, grounding, understanding. That religious framework kind of evolved over time and took greater and greater shape, and then of course spread across the world. But at the same time, you can bring it down to this very small level. This is the ritual that I practice every day with my grandma or with my family. I sit down and we do this. We go to church and we say these hymns. I meditate or I pray 5 times a day. All of these aspects feel dynamically personal, connect you to the kind of the structure that's just outside of your view. And then you can expand that and think about someone across the globe who's doing a very similar thing. And suddenly there's something that it kind of bridges that gap, something that makes you feel an inherent kinship even. And maybe that's a dynamic that's allowed us to evolve in a way that brings more of a harmony.
Definitely a role of religion has been historically to sort of form bridges between people where normally there would be no bridge.
Yeah, yeah.
Bridges between kin groups, bridges between people that you would normally say, well, I'm not related to you, so why should I care about you?
Right.
And so that's the golden rule, for instance, is like sort of a universal thing in major religions, where like treat others how you want to be treated.
Yeah.
That's an innovation. Are you encountering a stranger? Treat them the way that you would want to be treated,
Right.
instead of thinking that they're a threat or that you need to kill them or that you should run away. And that's been an innovation, clearly, that has helped culture to grow to where it is today. But and maybe we need to do another episode on ritual. But
Yeah.
I like the point you make, is that we can recognize even the small things in our lives that provide a lot of meaning. These small rituals, like you said, having a family dinner or a friend group, if just for fun, even like nothing more than fun. I mean, fun is meaningful much of the time, but a friend group will develop rituals like once a week we're gonna have a feast.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It's like, well, we're all gonna make a bunch of food and we're gonna eat it, and it's gonna be a special night for that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, why would you do that? It's like, well, because it's fun. I don't know, it feels good, and that's a ritual, and you can see that there's a lot of meaning that comes from that, as opposed to the idea of like, well, everyone just cook for themselves
Right.
every night.
Yeah.
It's like, wouldn't it be more fun if we came together and cooked?
Yes.
It's like, okay, well, what's happening there?
Yeah.
It's like there's some sort of structure emerging. And from this structure, you are reinserting yourself into something that you're meant to be in the first place.
Yeah.
And other rituals can, in college, I was a cross-country runner, and I had team rituals that were very, very meaningful and very fun that we would do annually.
Yeah.
And one of those things might be just running naked on the beach. Like once a year, we're doing this thing where we all go run naked on a public beach.
Yeah.
And it's silly, and it's sort of like, going against the rules, and it's kind of like messing with people who might see us, something like that. But that kind of ritual provides meaning.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be well, it might still be meaningful, but it probably wouldn't be as meaningful if you just did it by yourself.
Certainly.
Like, this is my ritual. Once a year, I run naked on the beach. It's like, I mean, I would have fun doing that, but you can see that this is sort of tapping into the evolution of religion.
Yeah.
Where did it come from?
Right.
Well, why is it adaptive? And
Yeah.
if we're talking about evolution, we're always going to kind of try and think about what is the function of this thing? Why did it evolve? What does it do that helps you accomplish your life goals, which is usually multi-generational survival. But people want a tribe, and when they're in a tribe, that's meaningful. And when the tribe can be organized and on the same page, that feels good. That helps you survive. And so if there can be a common understanding between the tribe, which is a myth, a story of what we're doing and why, where are we going, why are we surviving, why are we suffering so much, and there's a story that emerges that says, well, the tribe must stay together, and the tribe is traveling somewhere perhaps, and those of us who die live on in some way through us, and we have children, and our children will live on together, and that's some sort of story. And you could see how it would actually be highly adaptive for this kind of thing to evolve, and then to evolve through culture and take on sort of a mind of its own of the collective myth that brings people together and unites them in a common struggle, mixed with a lot of the interesting psychological facets of perceiving or anthropomorphizing things. You might say, like anthropomorphizing the earth, Mother Earth, or the sky, the god of the sun.
Yeah, turning them into gods.
And this is, another episode of talking about why is it that we anthropomorphize things, personify things, why are there gods and things like that. But this all combines into something that is this common, united way of life.
It's an interesting point, and I think it holds a lot of truth and a lot of resonance, but it also makes me think so much about the dynamics when those clash, because there actually isn't a fully shared religious instinct, at least not that we're totally aware of. So it's certainly adaptive to really bring people together and cultivate community and for bonding, and yet can also be utilized in a way that causes fractures and violence and hate of another group. And it kind of brings up the question for me, are we like rushing headlong to some sort of collective myth or collective religious instinct which we can all actually unite behind? Will there always be these dynamics of struggle between, different warring factions? Who knows?
I mean, that's a deep question.
Yeah.
And the things that are adaptive and things that are good for the tribe might be bad for other tribes.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah,
a
that
much more
happens.
complicated discussion about evolution and how humans actually function. And of course, that religion, it's important to understand that this instinct that we're talking about is not always for good.
Yes.
I mean, everything terrible that's ever happened in history, you could say, is a product of something like this happening.
Yeah.
You could say Nazism is this. It's
Yeah,
religious.
sure, yes,
It's people
yes.
uniting around a common myth. And the myth is that perhaps there's a conspiracy that the Jews are hatching that caused Germany to lose World War I. And,
Yeah.
that's a story, and people can rally around that and come together and unite in a certain way of life.
Yes.
And clearly this describes these terrible things that happen throughout history.
Right. The archetypal framework has no bias one way or the other.
Right.
It's infinite possibilities in all directions, and how it's grasped and utilized, and especially when a figure can anchor into that archetype and embody it, sometimes for good, like certainly the man who was Jesus was brought up into this powerful level of archetypal expression. And then you can look at someone like Hitler, who also is embodying this powerful archetypal energy where a whole, set of people can throw more and more energy into, and that builds, and that can be wielded in a very dark and shadowy way, or it can be wielded for peace and harmony and acceptance and loving thy neighbor.
Right. And so, and to just give another example of how this is at work in our current world, we're talking about sports, right? And that's a good example, but it's also politics. And so if we look at the current political situation, I think if you can understand what we're talking about, then you have to recognize that a lot of what's happening in politics is religious. And I don't just mean that there's Christians involved in politics. I mean that people are coming together, they're uniting around a common myth. There's an enemy that they might come up with, which is sort of the army of darkness, or the demons in some sense, archetypally. No one is literally thinking demons, but the demonization of the other people in some sense, and coming together for a way of life, united in a struggle. The community, collective organization of that feels really good. It feels really good to be part of something that's greater than yourself, part of a mission, and that's very much, and there's rituals, right? There's common rituals that are associated with politics, and there's saviors that emerge and villains that emerge. And so this is, again, a deeply religious pattern that we're seeing.
Yes.
And that's why it's so powerful, and also why it's so dangerous.
Yeah, and I think partly, we're talking a lot about the sort of community dynamic of how this instinct really drives us to connect with others. But I think a part of what I recognize, or at least relate to, in the religious instinct is how it drives the individual towards that dynamic of individuation, deeper self-reflection, contemplative nature, realization of oneself, realizing that there's something bigger, more than you.
Right. And this is sort of like the spirituality aspect of religion that we're more familiar with in our current society. Of like, what is spirituality?
Yes.
And what you're describing is this facet of religion that is about self-development in some way, or becoming more complete.
Yes. And what that does, hopefully, when one is really embracing that, and whether that's in the framework of an older cultural religious framework, you are stepping more into your true self, which allows you to see that other person who might be demonized now in a new light, to understand your neighbor better, to forgive where you really want to hold that grudge. It both empowers you, makes you more of a stronger, powerful individual, but also connects you much more deeply and truly and openly to the world and to others, and that in turn strengthens that communal development, that adaptive quality that this religious instinct tends to have.
Right. Driving you towards a structure. Again, if you develop a practice, we recognize having a practice is good. A lot of people have practices now. They meditate, they do yoga, all kinds of things that people are trying out to put in their toolbox. And this is something that religion has done in the past. It's a set of practices. It's not just a set of beliefs. It's a set of collective practices, but it's contemplative. There's prayer. There's chanting. There's dance, food, song. A
Yeah.
lot of these things are repeated things that you do, and the idea is that you're tapping into a structure that will help guide you towards a better place of being.
Yeah.
And individuation is very much going to a better place and becoming more complete and more whole. And at its best, that's what the religious instinct is guiding you towards, being all that you can be.
For this next portion on shadow work, we're going to dive a little bit into our personal experiences with the religious instinct. What is our experience with it in the past? Where are we at right now? How can we make sense of this? And maybe give you guys a few ideas of how to explore the religious instinct in your own life. So, Arran, tell us a little bit about your experience.
Right. So, probably like a lot of people who are my age who live in a Western country, who knows otherwise, but I was raised going to church. I was raised religious, you might say. My parents are Christian. Their parents, well, my mom's side was definitely very Christian. But either way, so this was a family thing. I was taken to church every Sunday for a very long time. I ended up leaving church pretty much as soon as I sort of felt like I could make my own decisions, which wasn't really honestly until around like 14. Even though for a while I didn't enjoy church, it was sort of a chore to me. But around the age of like 14, 15, I finally decided I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
I don't want to go, and I stopped. And the question is why? So something that we have to confront if we're talking about this is, what is religion in the modern age? And does it work? Does it accomplish what we say it does?
Yeah.
Does it result in individuation? Does it provide a healthy structure for which you can tap into and create a moral framework for yourself that's actually going to be good for you or the world? These are complicated questions because the world is changing very quickly. And what religion was even 50 years ago is not what it is anymore, much less 1,000 years ago. So I've always been a thinker, and I've always been very skeptical, and that is partly my personality. It's also partly going to school, my education, being taught to think critically and to look at the world scientifically.
Sure.
And I could not see past what appeared to me to be a set of absurd beliefs. And the story of Christ, for instance, the story that people have sins and God is imposing sins on people, like saying what you can't and can't do, and then God sends his only son, and then he forgives sins because his son dies, but it's like, but God, you implemented the sin system in the first place, so why do you even need to throw your son in there to, like, logically, even to someone who's like 9, it's kind of like, well, this doesn't make any sense, like, and that was me, and even beyond that, the community at church to me seemed a little naive, I guess you could say. The other children seemed not very interesting, and they seemed a little, I don't want to say brainwashed because that's strong. It's a strong term, but they kind of had a perspective to me that seemed like they had only been raised to experience good things and read good things and listen to appropriate music, and it didn't seem to me that they really matched up with what I was experiencing in school, for instance, with kids who seemed a little more in touch with what was going on in the world, whatever that means to a 10-year-old. But I just felt like I didn't fit in, and I felt like this wasn't my community. So I think that's the experience for a lot of people who are being raised Christian, let's say. I can't speak for other religions, but this sort of feeling of like, none of this makes any sense, and I don't like it, and therefore I'm leaving to go do whatever I want. And this is a tough question.
Yeah.
So you've had a similar experience.
Yeah. I was raised in a pretty religious family. We're Catholic, and I think that especially reflecting back on it, at my current age, I really consider myself someone who was like the prime candidate to be kind of initiated into a religious community, because I experience the world in a highly feeling, intuitive state. And for me, the religious instinct is something I just sense like deep, deep within my being. And even as an extremely young child, there was this fascination, a desire to kind of understand what that was, this kind of unknowing, unseeing, yet powerful, moving tide that felt all around me. And one of my earliest experiences, was probably 5 or 6 years old, was my first communion. And I was excited. I was ready to go to the church, and I was wearing my pretty white dress, and we were going to have a party afterwards. But I was most excited for what was going to happen at church with the priest. What was it going to feel like? Was there going to be just something that hit me? And I remember going and kind of being in line with all the other kids, and the priest just said, go do 5 Hail Marys, and then kind of pushed me off aside. And and it was really sad. I felt totally let down. And I'm so young at this point. It's kind of crazy to think about. But that was like a very early failure for me to connect to the religion in a meaningful way. And I think that really kind of set the tone, or maybe even symbolizes for me what it felt like, which is I'm looking for something, and I'm looking to be pulled in and grasped and educated and shown the way, and yet for some reason it's not landing. And if someone like me isn't getting gripped by it, then I think it's probably majorly failing for other people who aren't even interested. So that was a very early experience for me. This sense that I can't quite anchor into the religion, and I'm watching my family, my extended family, all acting very religious. Going to church, praying before dinner, observing certain rituals, and yet it seems to stop there. I don't know. I didn't feel a lot of that religious dynamic truly from a lot of my family members. And I think that's very hard to explain from the point of view of a child. But once again, as a very like feeling intuitive type, I just kind of can sense the shallowness or the hollowness
Right.
of it
Right.
from other people, and the kind of mindlessness, almost like we just do this. We do this because I was taught to do this, and they don't actually know what it means. It doesn't really hit them in their spirit. And, the only person that I really felt growing up that this was truly meaningful to was my grandma. And she taught me to pray at a very young age. And that, I think, is what has kept with me this tradition, this ritual, this sacredness, this connection to something higher than myself. She taught it to me because as a child, I'd have a lot of night terrors, and I would pray, I would do the Lord's Prayer, and it would bring me ease. It would connect me to something bigger. It would take me out of my experience. And that's part of like the religious instinct is guiding you through these times of terror and uncertainty, certainly, and also good times. But, I certainly didn't continue to really embed myself in the Catholic culture, and sort of slowly moved away from it. And I still sometimes talk about it in a way that like I'm Catholic, or like those are my family's ways. But at the same time, I've felt incredibly disconnected from it, and that recognizing that the religious symbols themselves are valid and important and dynamic, yet recognizing that they need to be filled with new meaning because they're not resonating to me anymore.
Right. So the current experience that I think both of us find ourselves at is we're definitely craving a group or a tribe that's a strong instinct of wanting there to be a strong community that participates together in rituals. And that word ritual kind of sounds a little over the top, but that's really what it is.
Yeah.
Coming together to do things, to align towards a certain way of life together, which, for me is mostly taking care of business, supporting yourself, supporting a family, having children, raising those children well. That's the sort of trajectory that I would like to be on, and I would like to be on that trajectory with other people that I care about,
Right.
that I love, and I would like to engage in things that are fun, obviously, and that feel good, and to have cool events and go on trips and have some sort of impact on the community at
Yeah.
large and do something that's good for the world. Those instincts are very strong. And if you really pursue those instincts and you really want to try and do this, you have to recognize that this is what religion does. This is what religion has always done.
Yeah.
That's at its core. I mean, things that we often call religion sort of deviate from this a little bit and get into weird zones that really aren't trying to align people around a better way of life that's good for the world. But that's what we're seeking. And so it's easy, I think, for someone to argue. It's like, well, you should have just stayed at church and you would have gotten all that.
Right.
So why'd you leave? And it's complicated because in one way that's true. It's like, you're right, I would have gotten that if I had stayed with my church and if I had made an effort to make that community my community, and all those things would be there. But at the same time, it's like, well, that community didn't work for some reason. It wasn't answering the questions I had, and it wasn't aligning me towards a place where I felt like I was growing, really.
Yeah.
And it's tough because sometimes, especially for children, is like, you don't know what's good for you.
Yeah.
And so there's this weird balance that we have to sort of understand. It's like, well, should religion be adapted into something that's more viable for people who are young today?
Yeah.
Or should religion stick with what it is and maintain these rules and boundaries the way they are, and people should impose that on children more and they'll realize when they get older that, like, this was actually the good path to go on. And that's a tough question. It's a little bit of both, I would say.
I agree. I think it's a little bit of both, because the heart of something so deep, at least when we're talking about like the major religions and those practices, is something that can't radically change from what it is. And yet there can be the recognition that there seems to be a growing disparity between the viability of it and the unviability of it.
Right.
So how can that be addressed? How can there be an evolution? The recognition that maybe for some people it's just never going to work, but at the same time, there's a lot of people that are looking for that, and that it would really fulfill something, some sort of place inside of them that feels hollow and needing something deeply meaningful and structured and sort of safe also to enter into.
Right. So whoever's listening should examine what it is that they do with their time. Are you a part of something that resembles a group or organization or a system?
Yeah.
Are you a sports fan? Are you a huge Star Wars fan? Are you part of a huge Star Wars community? Do you go to conventions? Are you really into politics? Do you sort of have a very sort of tribal thing going on with politics? A lot of us do nowadays.
Yeah.
And you should examine that and say, am I getting most of my meaning from this realm? If you're not part of some sort of tribe or group or something that resembles a collective set of practices and philosophies and rituals, if you're not part of something like that, it's likely that you're missing out on a lot of meaning and a lot of things that could be very healthy for your life. And you might want to examine what is it that you can do at this point to plug yourself into something that's greater than you, that will provide a healthy structure, that will connect you to others who want the same things. And that sounds kind of obvious. It's like, whoa, join a club. Like, it's like, true, but people don't realize how much we're oriented in this way that is religious. And, for a lot of people, I would say, I think it's fair advice to say, join a religion.
Yeah, sure.
What the things that people think are going to be bad about doing that, I think, are a little exaggerated.
Right. They fear rigidity or like neurotic behavior or control or something like that. But there is so much to explore, so many different areas to kind of dive into and to find what fits right, and, go from one church to another, one synagogue to another, or one group that's meeting up talking about this, and find what really is calling to you and what sits right, because there's people with a very similar mission out there. And when you come together in that way, you realize that you're not alone in this sort of crazy game of life. And it helps you, it strengthens you, it connects you to another, and it can really bring a lot of richness to one's experience.
All right, now it's time for a dream from one of our audience members. This is from a 29-year-old female, and here's the dream. An old friend who I no longer speak to and I were stowaways on a large wagon in a caravan. We sat down at a dinner table and were accepted by the group. We passed through a curtain to a wooden amphitheater. As the caravan started moving, we realized we were actually on the back of a large black dragon, and we fell off. My ex-friend grabbed onto me, and I held onto the dragon's tail. We were flying low over a dark field of angry villagers. I was struck in the arm holding the dragon by a flaming arrow, but I didn't let go. I felt our chances were better with the dragon than on the field.
This dream is so cool.
Yeah, it's very like medieval. There's like a lot of like medieval imagery going on, which I find interesting.
Yes, definitely. It gives you that mythopoetic, archetypal feel to it, fantastical. So we know we're dealing with that deep unconscious material. Often when that happens, it's kind of taking shape around things that we would often find in fictional stories and things like that.
Yeah.
So where to start with this dream? One of the things that really first grabbed me was this dynamic of connection to some sort of group or collective of people, because we start this dream with the friend and the dreamer as stowaways in this caravan. And just the word stowaways already puts the dreamer outside of a group. They're not actually part of this collective, but through this process, they're accepted. They have dinner, and there's this feeling of acceptance. But then things start to shift and change. And once she realizes that she's on this black dragon and they're flying over this field, there is a set of villagers, another sort of community symbol, that are attacking the dreamer and the dragon. So we're dealing with some sort of orientation or some sort of experience towards the external world, maybe her role in society, how she feels that she fits in, feeling in it and then out of it. There's this fluctuating dynamic that's happening in the dream.
Right, and there's a lot of movement to the dream. There's a lot of traveling. She's a stowaway with her friend, which means that she is on a journey somewhere, but she actually doesn't know where she's going, perhaps, because she's not driving.
Right, she's not driving.
Someone else is driving, and she has to remain unseen. So she's not only possibly going somewhere that she doesn't know where she's going, she doesn't feel safe, and there's a lot of mystery, a lot of tension there with what's going to happen, perhaps. And the acceptance into the group, as you say, there's a lot of coming in and out of safety and grounding, and in and out of vision, becoming visible, and then things changing and departing back and forth.
Yes, the dreamer in their submission form mentions that they've been hovering back and forth between starting their own business. So I see that dynamic, that even just that energetic signature imprinted on the dream, because what happens when you are at the helm of starting your own business? You put yourself out there, you're out in the world. How are you going to be received? What's your client base going to be like? How does that feel for you personally? And she's kind of moving. There's that the I'm in it and I'm not in it. I want it and I don't want it. I'm open to it and I'm pushing it away. It's very ambivalent in that way. And I think that she kind of finds herself sort of caught right now in life in between this crossroads, and this dream seems to be working through some of that for her in the deep unconscious. Another couple of points that are interesting to explore is her friend that's with her. She mentions in her submission form to us that this is an old friend, someone she had a falling out with, but that the name of the individual brings to mind the Gnostic goddess Sophia, and that which is connected to wisdom and this deeper archetype.
Philosophia is love of wisdom.
Yeah. And something that I found interesting with thinking about the archetype of this goddess is that there is a archetypal framework of the fall and rise of Sophia in her mythology, in her history. And so this figure, this friend, should be thought of subjectively for the dreamer, not as, an actual objective representation of this ex-friend who she's had the falling out with,
Sure.
but certainly that the dynamic of the loss, something you had and now it's gone, the figure kind of maybe even holding some of that archetypal material of Sophia is representative of those inner dynamics inside of her. So maybe this is a shadow character, some sort of complex nature that she needs to connect to and understand, because they're very much in partnership in this dream, and they're kind of going through the exploration and the adventure together. So whatever that's kind of represents for her, whether that's this dynamic of connecting to something and feeling a part of it and then losing it, which we see also with the community dynamic, with the group dynamic, this might be an archetypal narrative, an arc that's really important for her to explore right now. Maybe she's on the fall. Maybe she's feeling the confusion, the loss of grounding, kind of going deep into the underworld, going deeper into her own unconscious material. And part of that is recognizing maybe that deep inner wisdom, that Sophia nature that's trying to emerge inside of herself as well.
Right. So there's clearly projections of herself on the friend and the dragon, I would say.
Yes.
And these figures are sort of united in some sense because they're together. She doesn't perceive the dragon as being scary or threatening. It's a black dragon. So it's the shadow, it's the unconscious, it's the power of the content that's under the surface that you could harness and you could write it to freedom or to a better place. We talk about the golden shadow. That's exactly what we're talking about. But the angry villagers, they are the outer world. They're whatever the external obstacles, the scary place that she might be venturing into with her business.
Right, that or the projection of the fear of that, right?
The fear that the feeling of eyes being on you, the feeling that people are watching you, the feeling that the sort of vague mass of people representing the world might tear you apart if you were to fall.
Yeah.
And so she's flying above them, and there's a lot of fear that she's going to fall. But as long as she holds onto the dragon, maybe she'll be okay. And then she's struck in the arm that's holding the dragon, that connection, that bridge between her and her unconscious, let's say, or that bridge between her and that deep primordial energy, that energy of creation is struck with a flaming arrow and it's on fire, and that's interesting. But she doesn't let go.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of energy in this bridge that she has between her and the dragon, and there's a lot of tension there, and it feels painful, and perhaps it's going to rip her apart or set her on fire or something like that. But she holds on, and that really speaks to this path of growth, this path of individuation, of you disintegrate in some ways, and it's painful, and you leave behind what doesn't belong, but then you reintegrate and you come back into yourself, and you gain strength, and then you disintegrate again, and there's so much pain and suffering that goes into this growth of becoming the person you're meant to be, of becoming more complete.
Yes, that's the alchemical stage of the Negrito. It's the blackening, it's the disintegration, it's the just everything kind of falling apart, and it's the sort of downward spiral into oneself where you're deep in the shadow, deep in the unconscious material. But that's a necessary step on this path of evolution and of growth, because it allows you to get in touch with the shadow material. It allows you to see parts of yourself that are trying to emerge, the sort of dark and terrible and scary parts of the shadow, but also the golden parts as well. So this dragon, I find, is such a powerful, interesting symbol, very much, for me at least, bringing up that primordial energy, as you talked about, instinctive, unconscious. And when we deal with that environment, sort of generated by the sort of powerful ordering principle of our unconscious, it's often driving us towards evolution and transformation and realization. And that's not an easy path to walk. It's painful. It is hard. We want to resist it, but we have to sort of embrace going into the underworld. We have to embrace the initiations that are happening and the trials that are happening. And she has this link up between she's holding onto the dragon, the friend is holding onto her. So there's a dynamic connection between the instinctual and conscious energy. There's the connection with the friend who could be inner wisdom that's trying to emerge, or maybe the arc of her fall and eventual rise, the kind of phoenix that will eventually rise from the ashes, hopefully. So much of the content of this dream is, I think, hitting a place where the dreamer should consider what it means for her to really step out into the world, to really contemplate and reflect on these fears and hesitations, but recognize that at that same time, by doing that work, you're resolving and then hopefully integrating some of that, those fears, those anxieties, the shadow material that's around that. And what's going to come up in its place is certainty and validation and self-assurance, and certainly a deeper connection to these parts of yourself that's going to allow you to rise up.
Do you have a question for us? Do you have a dream you'd like us to analyze? Is there a topic you'd like us to cover?
We want to hear from you. Contact us through the submission form, which can be found at our Instagram page at Golden Shadow Podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can find the link in the description down below.
Thanks for listening.
See you later.
If you find this podcast useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Golden Shadow Podcast. Thank you.